The British Empire of the 19th and early 20th centuries was history's first truly global hegemon. It held dominion over a quarter of the world and its inhabitants, was the leading power in science and technology, and exercised near-total sovereignty over the world's oceans. However, if you had asked the average European from the years 1700 to 1812 who they believed would rise to global dominance, their answer would likely not have been Great Britain, but rather France. During this era, France was Europe's greatest power, possessing a powerful military, stable leadership, and a massive economy and population. But, despite all these advantages, when presented with two major opportunities over this time period, France would ultimately fail to capitalize on them. To understand why France failed, we have to go back to its first real opportunity, the War of the Spanish Succession. However, to truly grasp the importance of this war for France, we must understand its position within Europe at the time. From 1643 to 1715, France was ruled by King Louis XIV, more commonly known as the Sun King. Over the course of his long reign, he centralized all power within the kingdom into his own hands, stripping it from the nobility. This system of absolute monarchy he established would be inherited by all his future successors. Louis XIV would use his absolute rule over France to wage numerous wars across Europe, each one part of his grand strategy to elevate the nation from being the continent's strongest nation into its undisputed hegemon. Naturally, Louis's expansionist ambitions alarmed the other nations of Europe, especially the continent's great powers. What made France so threatening was the vast demographic, military, and economic gap between it and the rest of Europe. While Europeans in later centuries would come to fear the possibility of the Russian Empire steamrolling the continent through sheer population alone, in the early modern era, that fear was of France. In 1700, France had a population at least 50% larger than any other European nation, and was the fifth most populous country in the world. Unlike the 20th century army of Imperial Russia, the French military didn't rely just on overwhelming numbers, as France was on the cutting edge of offensive military advancements, equipped with the latest firearms and artillery of the time. France was also extremely well fortified. Under the direction of the renowned engineer Sébastien Vauban, the country improved upon the bastion fort design and upgraded its infrastructure to allow for faster troop movement. All of this was supported by an economy that was twice the size of any other in Europe. At this point, you might be thinking it would be impossible for any individual European nation to rival France, and you'd be entirely correct. The great powers of Europe recognized this as well, leading them to form several coalitions with the goal of containing French expansion. The most important of these coalitions formed by the great powers was the Grand Alliance, established in 1689. It consisted of England, the Dutch Republic, Prussia, Portugal, and the Habsburg monarchy, a collection of various territories ruled by the same dynasty. This alliance was predated by other coalitions, composed of slightly different members, dating back as far as 1667. These nations would work together to oppose French expansion in the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the Reunions, and most recently, the 9 Years' War. But, by far the most significant of these wars between France and the coalitions would be the War of the Spanish Succession. Starting in 1701, the war's origins are fairly uncomplicated. Before his passing in 1700, the childless Charles II of Spain willed his realm to Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, which, if realized, would have led to a unification of the Spanish Empire and the Kingdom of France. Though Spain had declined greatly from its height in the 1500s, financially ruined from its numerous failed wars in its bid to become Europe's hegemon, such a union would still have all but guaranteed French hegemony over Europe. This, in addition to the vast colonial holdings of the Spanish Empire, would have been a massive step towards global hegemony for France. Seeking to prevent this unification to preserve the balance of power, the Grand Alliance declared war on France. Lasting till 1714, the War of the Spanish Succession would be Europe's most deadly conflict since the 30 Years' War of the previous century. In its early years, France would enjoy considerable success, pursuing a strategy known as mixed war, where it would assume a primarily defensive stance to protect key fortresses and locations, while simultaneously engaging in limited offensive actions against the alliance. This strategy would allow France to conquer parts of Italy and the Low Countries by 1704, while being fortified against reprisals from the Grand Alliance. The main objective of France during the conflict was to secure Philip V's control over Spain and then bring the war to a swift conclusion. To this end, France allied with the Duchy of Bavaria, a traditional enemy of the Habsburg monarchy, in an attempt to capture Vienna, the capital of Austria and the heart of Habsburg power. Despite the two's best efforts to knock the Habsburgs out the war, they would be decisively beaten at the Battle of Blenheim by the Grand Alliance. With a swift victory no longer possible, France found itself trapped in a long and exhausting conflict, fighting across 5 different fronts against the great powers of Europe. Though the war would drag on for another decade, most of it would be a stalemate, with offers of peace made as early as 1708. Because Philip V's position in Spain was fortified, and the great powers of Europe were militarily and economically exhausted from the conflict, he was allowed to remain King of Spain after the war. However, he and his descendants were forbidden from ever becoming the kings of France, as according to the treaty, quote, because of the great danger which threatened the liberty and safety of all Europe from the too close conjunction of the kingdoms of Spain and France, the same person should never become king of both kingdoms. While having a member of its ruling dynasty on the Spanish throne would seem like a beneficial thing for France, it would not entirely be the case, as although the two branches would cooperate, there would also be times of hostility, going so far as to joining wars on different sides. This was compounded by Spain's continued decline throughout the century, though reforms implemented by the Spanish kings were able to slow the process. Along with failing to unify with Spain, the war also left France in a weaker economic and military position. By Louis XIV's death in 1715, France stood on the verge of bankruptcy due to the War of the Spanish Succession, on top of the previous ones waged during the Sun King's reign. This economic crisis would be further exacerbated by France's involvement in future conflicts, just as expensive, if not more so, under Louis XIV's successor, Louis XV. The country would also suffer from recurring food shortages throughout the 18th century, along with the bursting of the Mississippi financial bubble in 1720, an event that crashed the French stock market and added to the nation's already mounting debt. While France's economy had achieved a certain degree of stability by the mid-18th century, in many ways, it never fully recovered. Despite all these issues plaguing France, it would remain Europe's leading power, though no longer in a position to establish continental or global hegemony. Before we get to France's second opportunity toward the end of the century, it's crucial to understand the events that transpired before it. In the decades following the War of the Spanish Succession, England, now Great Britain following the 1707 Act of Union, emerged as Europe's chief colonial power and France's primary rival. By 1750, it had built a global empire with colonies in India, West Africa, South America, and most critically, North America. Britain's North American colonies, collectively known as New England, directly bordered France's own colony of New France. When the 7 Years' War broke out in 1756, Britain's naval superiority, combined with New England's overwhelming population advantage of roughly 100-7 over New France, would culminate in a decisive French defeat. In the resulting peace treaty, Britain stripped France of nearly all its North American territory. In addition to losing the war, France was plunged into even deeper debt, a burden that only grew when it joined the American Revolution in an effort to take revenge on Britain. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, ending the war and securing American independence, France had achieved its goal of weakening Britain. However, this victory came at the cost of being the final straw that broke the back of the French economy. In 1789, decades of financial mismanagement finally caught up with France, and when combined with growing social unrest, culminated in the outbreak of the French Revolution. Interestingly, by that point, France had been ruled by only 3 monarchs over the previous 146 years, a continuity that, in theory, should have contributed to the nation's stability. However, considering the state France found itself in, it seemed it had been rather unfortunate with the monarchs it had. The revolution ultimately led to the establishment of the French Republic and the eventual abolition of the monarchy. These developments in France were deeply concerning to the monarchies across Europe, who feared that the French Revolution would inspire similar uprisings in their own realms. As a result, the great powers of Europe once again formed a coalition to oppose France, marking the beginning of the Wars of the Coalitions. Yet despite being in a state of near-perpetual political upheaval, France managed not only to hold its own against the coalition, but for the first time in nearly a century, achieve significant territorial gains in Europe. The driving force behind this newfound military success was the meritocratic reforms introduced during the French Revolution, which allowed individuals to rise based on ability rather than birth. As a result, the military came to be led by talented and experienced commanders, who by 1798 had conquered the Low Countries and most of Italy. The most exceptional among them was Napoleon Bonaparte, who gained immense popularity with the French people through his successful campaigns in Italy. In 1799, capitalizing on his reputation as a war hero, Napoleon overthrew the French government in a coup and established a dictatorship. Now in control of the nation, Napoleon would fully unlock France's potential. Under his leadership, France steamrolled much of the continent using the innovative tactics he had popularized, which emphasized speed, flexibility, and decisive engagements, rather than the slow, cautious military doctrine favored by most generals of the time. Through this superior approach to warfare, Napoleon in 5 years built an empire that surpassed the efforts of all previous French monarchs. By 1811, the First French Empire, established after Napoleon's coronation in 1804, was now the hegemon of Europe, dominating most of the continent through direct annexation, puppet regimes known as sister republics, and the continental system, an economic blockade designed to force Great Britain to make peace with France and its position as Europe's hegemon. While France had achieved near-total domination of continental Europe, its global empire remained virtually non-existent. Technically, it ruled over a vast domain through conquered nations and client states. But in reality, France had little to no control over these territories. The most notable example was Spain. Although Napoleon had turned Spain into a client state when he installed his brother as king, French authority did not extend to the Spanish colonies. Most Spanish subjects, both overseas and domestically, viewed Joseph as an illegitimate ruler, and even if the colonies had accepted his rule, British naval supremacy, cemented at the decisive Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, made holding overseas possessions nearly impossible. Along with thwarting any French aspirations for an overseas empire, Britain also served as the chief financier of the wars of the coalitions. It poured money into its continental allies, allowing them to keep fighting France, even after repeated defeats and forced peace treaties, only to return to war a few years later. With each new conflict, French victories became less and less decisive, as France's enemies began adopting its strategies and technology. Meanwhile, the wars gradually drained the French state of both resources and manpower, causing the public's opinion of Napoleon to sour. The near-constant state of war with Europe's great powers, combined with serious blunders by Napoleon in Spain and Russia, would ultimately lead to France's defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition in 1814, and to the abdication of Napoleon Bonaparte. With Napoleon's fall came the dismantling of a decade of French hegemony over Europe. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the death toll had reached 6 million people across more than a dozen nations, with over a third of them coming from France, devastating an entire generation of the nation's fighting-age population. From 1814 onward, France would never again be in a position to become the world's hegemon. Though it remained one of the great powers of Europe, the country suffered from political instability throughout the 19th century, cycling through a series of regimes, ranging from republics to monarchies. Simultaneously, Britain was establishing history's largest empire and instituting the Pax Britannica. In what would have been a shock to those who lived in the 1700s and early 1800s, there would be no French century. Instead, the world would witness a British one.